The morning sun cast long shadows across the city as Alexander Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, surveying his empire below. At 34, he had built Sterling Tech from a college startup into a billion-dollar corporation that shaped how the world communicated. His sharp suit, worth more than most people's monthly salary, hung perfectly on his tall frame as he reviewed the day's acquisitions. "The Henderson Street property is ready for your signature, Mr. Sterling," his assistant Marcus announced, placing a leather portfolio on the mahogany desk. "The community school there has been struggling financially for years. Once we acquire it, we can demolish and begin construction on the new data center within 6 months." Alexander barely glanced at the papers as he signed, his mind already moving to the next deal. This was just another transaction in his meticulously planned expansion. The small school meant nothing to him, just outdated brick and mortar occupying prime real estate in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. He had no idea that his signature would set in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about power, success, and the one thing money couldn't buy. 3 miles away, Emma Rodriguez unlocked the heavy doors of Henderson Elementary, her worn leather bag slung over her shoulder and a thermos of homemade coffee in her hand. At 28, she had been teaching here for 5 years, and every morning still filled her with the same sense of purpose that had driven her to education in the first place. "Good morning, Miss Rodriguez," called out Jamie, a 7-year-old with gap-toothed grin, running up to her with a crumpled drawing. "What beautiful artwork, Jamie," Emma said, kneeling to his level despite her faded dress. "Tell me about it." And as Jamie launched into an elaborate explanation about his family of stick figures, Emma couldn't help but smile. This was why she stayed. Not for the salary that barely covered her tiny apartment rent, not for the outdated textbooks she often supplemented with her own money, but for moments like these. Her students didn't see her patched shoes or the fact that she brought the same peanut butter sandwich for lunch every day. They saw someone who believed in them unconditionally. The morning routine began as children filtered in, their voices creating a symphony of languages and dreams that filled Emma's heart with warmth she wouldn't trade for all the money in the world. The news arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day. Principal Martinez called an emergency staff meeting during lunch, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained worry. The 23 teachers of Henderson Elementary gathered in the small conference room, the same space where they celebrated student achievements and planned fundraisers for basic supplies. "I've just received notice," Principal Martinez began, his voice heavy with resignation, "that our building has been sold to Sterling Tech Corporation. We have 60 days to relocate or close permanently." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught second grade for 30 years, looked as though she might faint. The younger teachers exchanged worried glances, understanding immediately what this meant for their students, many of whom had never known stability outside these walls. Emma felt her heart sink into her stomach. These children needed consistency, not another upheaval in lives already marked by uncertainty. Many of her students came from families struggling to make ends meet, and Henderson Elementary wasn't just their school. It was their safe haven, their source of daily meals, their promise of a better future. "What can we do?" Emma asked, her voice cutting through the chaos. Principal Martinez shook his head sadly. "Against Sterling Tech? Nothing. Alexander Sterling doesn't negotiate. He simply takes what he wants." That evening, Emma sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop screen, displaying Sterling Tech's corporate website. Alexander Sterling's professional headshot looked back at her, sharp jawline, piercing grey eyes, and an expression of absolute confidence. This man had probably never been told no in his entire privileged life. But as Emma looked at the photos of her students she kept on her desk, Jamie, with his gap-toothed smile, Maria reading her first book, Carlos proudly displaying his science project. She felt something steel inside her chest. These children deserved better than being treated as collateral damage in some billionaire's expansion plan. The next morning, Emma did something that would have been unthinkable just days before. She put on her best dress, a simple navy blue one she usually saved for parent conferences, and took the subway downtown to Sterling Tech's gleaming headquarters. The corporate lobby intimidated her with its soaring ceilings and marble floors, but Emma squared her shoulders and approached the reception desk. "I need to speak with Alexander Sterling," she announced to the impeccably dressed receptionist. "Do you have an appointment?" the woman asked, barely looking up from her computer. "No, but I'm here about Henderson Elementary School. He'll want to hear what I have to say." The receptionist's expression suggested otherwise, but something in Emma's tone made her pick up the phone. Alexander Sterling was reviewing quarterly projections when Marcus announced an unexpected visitor. "Sir, there's a teacher here about the Henderson Street property. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems persistent." Alexander glanced at his Rolex, a habit that had become second nature when dealing with interruptions. 5 minutes, he said curtly. In his experience, most people could be dismissed quickly once they realized who they were dealing with. When Emma Rodriguez walked into his office, Alexander's first thought was that she looked completely out of place among the modern steel and leather furnishings. Her simple dress and worn shoes belonged in a different world from his corporate empire. Yet something about the way she carried herself, straight-backed and determined despite her obvious nervousness, caught his attention. "Mr. Sterling," Emma began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here to discuss Henderson Elementary." "There's nothing to discuss," Alexander replied dismissively, not looking up from his papers. "The acquisition is complete. The building will be demolished next month." "Those aren't just buildings you're demolishing," Emma said, stepping closer to his desk. "That's a community. That's hundreds of children's futures you're destroying for your data center." For the first time in years, someone had spoken to Alexander Sterling without deference or fear. He looked up, meeting her brown eyes directly, and felt an unexpected jolt of something he couldn't immediately name. "Miss Rodriguez, isn't it?" Alexander said, finally giving her his full attention. "I appreciate your passion, but this is business. I'm sure your students can find other schools." "Can they?" Emma challenged, her voice growing stronger. "Do you know that 60% of our students rely on our free breakfast and lunch programs? That many of them walk to school because their families can't afford transportation to distant schools? That we have the only ESL program in the district?" Alexander found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the fire in her eyes and the way her hands gestured expressively. He was accustomed to people wanting something from him, money, connections, opportunities, but Emma Rodriguez seemed to want something far more complex. For him to care about people he'd never met. "I understand your concerns," he said, falling back on his usual corporate responses, "but Sterling Tech employs thousands of people. This data center will bring jobs to the community." "Jobs that require college degrees," Emma shot back. "What about the jobs our school provides? What about Mrs. Patterson, who's taught here for 30 years? What about the cafeteria workers, the custodial staff? What about the future jobs we're creating by educating these children?" Alexander felt an unfamiliar sensation, the ground shifting beneath his certainties. This woman was challenging not just his business decision, but his entire worldview. And despite himself, he found her arguments compelling. Against his better judgment and Marcus's visible horror, Alexander found himself driving through Emma's neighborhood that weekend. His black Bentley drew stares from children playing on the sidewalks and neighbors tending small front gardens. This wasn't the sterile environment of his penthouses and country clubs. This was a community where people knew each other's names and borrowed cups of sugar. He parked outside Henderson Elementary, studying the building he'd dismissed so easily in boardroom presentations. The brick facade showed its age, but someone had planted flower beds along the entrance. Colorful murals decorated the walls, clearly student artwork celebrating different cultures and dreams. "You're him, aren't you?" Alexander turned to find a young boy, maybe 8 years old, approaching with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "I'm Carlos," the boy continued. "Miss Rodriguez is my teacher. She says you want to tear down our school." Before Alexander could respond, more children appeared, drawn by the unusual sight of an expensive car in their neighborhood. They surrounded him with questions and observations delivered with the brutal honesty of youth. "Are you really rich?" asked a little girl with pigtails. "Why do you want to hurt our school?" demanded another boy, his protective instincts clearly activated. Alexander found himself in the most uncomfortable conversation of his adult life, trying to explain business decisions to children who saw only the potential destruction of their safe haven. "You followed me," Emma said, looking up from her stack of papers to find Alexander Sterling standing beside her table at Rosa's Cafe, the small coffee shop where she spent her Sunday afternoons grading assignments. "I was in the neighborhood," Alexander replied, a statement so obviously false that Emma almost smiled despite her wariness. "Would you like to sit?" she offered, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. She wasn't sure why she made the offer. Perhaps because seeing him here out of his corporate armor made him seem more human somehow. Alexander hesitated. When was the last time he'd sat in a place like this? The coffee shop was warm and cluttered, filled with mismatched furniture and local artwork. It was the antithesis of the sterile perfection he surrounded himself with. "What are you working on?" he asked, settling into the worn chair. "Progress reports," Emma replied, turning one of the papers so he could see. "This is Jamie's reading assessment. He couldn't recognize his own name when he started kindergarten. Now he's reading at grade level." As Emma showed him more examples, children overcoming language barriers, students discovering hidden talents, families finding stability through the school's support programs, Alexander began to understand what he was truly planning to destroy. Each paper represented not just academic progress, but transformed lives. "Why teaching?" he found himself asking. Emma looked surprised by the personal question. "Because I believe every child deserves someone who sees their potential, even when they can't see it themselves." Over the following weeks, something unprecedented happened in Alexander Sterling's carefully controlled life. He began to doubt himself. The confidence that had driven his business success started to feel more like arrogance when measured against Emma Rodriguez's unwavering dedication to her students. He found excuses to drive by the school during his lunch hours, watching as Emma supervised recess with the kind of engaged attention he'd never seen from his own expensive private school teachers. She knew every child's name, every family's story, every small victory and struggle. "Sir," Marcus said carefully during one of their morning briefings, "the Henderson Street demolition has been delayed 3 times. The construction crew is asking for clarity on the timeline." Alexander stared out his window, seeing not his corporate empire, but a small brick building where miracles happened daily on a shoestring budget. "What would it cost to relocate the school?" he asked suddenly. Marcus blinked in surprise. "Sir? I asked what it would cost to relocate Henderson Elementary to a comparable facility in the same neighborhood." I don't know, sir. We've never considered that option." "Find out," Alexander said, making a decision that surprised him as much as it did his assistant. "And Marcus, look into our corporate foundation budget. I want to know what kind of educational initiatives we could fund." For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling was discovering that some victories required giving up rather than taking. The Sterling Tech Board meeting that would change everything began like any other. 12 of the city's most powerful business leaders sat around the mahogany conference table, reviewing quarterly reports and expansion plans. Alexander had called this meeting to discuss something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire, "I'm proposing we modify our Henderson Street acquisition strategy." The room fell silent. Richard Morrison, the board's longest-serving member, spoke first. "Modify how exactly? The demolition permits are approved. Instead of demolishing Henderson Elementary, I propose we relocate the school to a new state-of-the-art facility within the same neighborhood. Sterling Tech will fund the construction and provide ongoing educational technology support." The silence that followed was deafening. Board members exchanged glances that ranged from confused to concerned. This wasn't the Alexander Sterling they knew, the man who had built a fortune by making ruthless, efficient decisions. "Alexander," Morrison said carefully, "this would cost us millions and delay the data center construction by at least a year. What possible business justification?" "The justification," Alexander interrupted, "is that some things matter more than quarterly profits. These children and their families are part of the community we're expanding into. We can choose to be a destructive force or a constructive one." The room erupted in concerned murmurs as board members realized their CEO had undergone a fundamental transformation that threatened everything they thought they knew about Sterling Tech's direction. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new Henderson Elementary took place on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after Emma Rodriguez had first walked into Alexander Sterling's office. The original school building still stood proudly, now scheduled for renovation into a community center rather than demolition. Emma stood beside the ceremonial golden shovel, still hardly believing this was real. The new school would have everything her students had ever needed: modern classrooms, a full library, a gymnasium, technology labs, and even an expanded cafeteria program. "Miss Rodriguez," Alexander said, approaching her before the ceremony began. He looked different somehow, less rigid, more present. "I have something for you." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a scholarship fund proposal bearing her name: the Emma Rodriguez Educational Excellence Foundation, designed to support teachers in underserved communities throughout the city. "I don't understand," Emma said, looking up at him with wonder. "You taught me something I'd forgotten," Alexander replied, his grey eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "That the most valuable investments aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in human potential. You showed me that real power lies in empowering others." As Emma watched her students playing nearby, their laughter filling the air with pure joy, she realized that sometimes the most important victories came not from fighting against someone, but from helping them discover the best version of themselves. The ceremony began with Carlos, now in 2nd grade, proudly reading a poem he'd written about dreams and new beginnings. 1 year later, the new Henderson Elementary had become a model for urban education reform. Alexander found himself visiting regularly, not as the corporate benefactor making obligatory appearances, but as someone genuinely invested in the success of every student. "Mr. Sterling!" Jamie called out, running up with a book clutched in his small hands. The gap-toothed 6-year-old had become a voracious reader, devouring every book in the new library. "What are you reading today, Jamie?" Alexander asked, kneeling to the boy's level, a gesture that would have been impossible for him just 2 years earlier. As Jamie launched into an enthusiastic description of his latest literary adventure, Alexander caught Emma's eye across the hallway. She was supervising a group of students working on a science project, her face radiant with the same passion that had first challenged everything he thought he knew about success. Their relationship had evolved slowly, built on shared respect and common purpose. Alexander had learned that Emma couldn't be impressed by grand gestures or expensive gifts. What moved her was genuine commitment to her students' welfare and authentic personal growth. "You did this," Alexander said later, as they walked through the bustling hallways of the school he had once planned to destroy. "We did this," Emma corrected gently. "You chose to listen. You chose to change. That's the hardest choice anyone can make." Alexander smiled, understanding finally that the greatest acquisition of his career hadn't been a company or a building. It had been the wisdom to know when to say yes to something greater than himself. The annual Henderson Elementary Community Celebration had grown into one of the city's most beloved events. What had started as a simple thank you dinner had evolved into a neighborhood festival that celebrated not just educational achievement, but the power of community to transform lives. Emma stood on the small stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, students, families, teachers, and community leaders who had all played a part in this remarkable transformation. Alexander sat in the front row, no longer the intimidating billionaire who had once threatened their world, but a true partner in their mission. 2 years ago, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "we learned that someone wanted to tear down our school. We were afraid, but we didn't give up. We believed that our children deserved better, and we were willing to fight for that belief." The crowd responded with warm applause, but Emma raised her hand gently to continue. "What we discovered was that sometimes the people who seem like our enemies are just people who haven't yet learned to see what we see. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the chance to become better than they thought possible." Her eyes found Alexander's in the crowd, and she smiled, the same determined smile that had first walked into his office and refused to be dismissed. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our students' achievements, but the reminder that when we choose hope over fear, when we choose community over profit, when we choose love over indifference, we can change the world, one heart, one mind, one child at a time." Thank you so much for listening to our story of Emma and Alexander and how a teacher's courage to say no opened both their hearts to saying yes to something beautiful. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what moments in this story touched your heart the most. Your support and engagement mean the world to us. And knowing that our stories reach people around the globe fills us with the same hope that Emma carried into that corporate office. Until our next story, remember that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can create the biggest changes.